Please leave a comment where in the world you are listening from. When I was in 3rd grade, I made a friend named Nicholas. Nicky for short. We were both on the quieter side compared to our classmates, and we both shared a love for pudding cups. One day at school, Nicky forgot his lunch at home, so I told him he could have my pudding cup. That's how we became friends. From that moment on, we shared my pudding cups every day. The other kids in our class used to tease us, accusing us of having crushes on each other and chant that horrible to an 8-year-old at least, KSNG song all the time. It had become customary for Nicky and I to separate ourselves from the other kids at recess and at lunch. We had a big tree we would always meet under in the morning, at recess, and for a few minutes after school before our parents came to pick us up. Nicky himself lived with his older sister and single mother. He tried explaining the concept of divorce to me once, but in my 8-year-old mind it didn't make sense that his parents weren't together, happily married. As you can imagine, my parents were married, and my home life was the epitome of adoring, nuclear family. Imagine Full House, except with a mother who hadn't passed away, and a couple of cousins instead of uncles. I can't recall a single moment in my childhood where I left unloved or uncared for in any way. I soon realized that was a rarity. During one of mine and Nicky's morning visits to the tree, as we had cleverly nicknamed it, he invited me to his birthday party. He excitedly unzipped his backpack and withdrew an invitation card made of blue construction paper. There was a hand-drawn tree on the front, 2 little kids of approximately mine and Nicky's size and coloring, and a home address scribbled inside. To this day I still have it. When the bell rang, he and I ran inside with the rest of the kids, and I waited all day for him to give out the rest of his birthday invitations, but he never did. I was the only one he had invited. Because the other kids teased us so much, my 8-year-old mind had chalked it up to the conclusion that he didn't want any bullies there and had therefore invited his only friend, me. Suffice to say I was flattered and happy. I gave the card to my mother later on in the evening. She smiled and said, "How cute," and very quickly gave me permission to go. It was my first non-family birthday party. The next day I went to the store with my mother and older brother, and we picked out a birthday present for Nicky. He and I were heavily into Transformers, so we got him a tiny Transformer after getting permission from his mother, and I wrapped it up in blue wrapping paper all by myself. His birthday was on the following Saturday. My mother dropped me off at Nicky's house, briefly speaking with his mother in the kitchen, discussing pickup times and how fast they're growing, before kissing me on the forehead goodbye. Because Nicky, his sister, and I were the only ones there, we decided to play a couple of board games and then tag when it wasn't raining anymore. We were in the backyard. It got to be a little sunny after, and Nicky and I fell deep into our dramatic reenactment of the latest and most exciting Power Rangers episode to date, that we had seen at least. His sister, a preteen at the time, went inside for a minute to check something, which Nicky later revealed to me was a code phrase she used when she wanted to talk to the cute neighbor boy on the phone. Inside the kitchen, his mother was cooking and keeping an eye on us through the window. It was only as we went inside to eat that I realized there were no decorations. In fact, there wasn't anything to signify that it was Nicky's birthday at all, except for the homemade chocolate cake. I had loosely gathered that Nicky's family didn't have a lot of money, and that maybe that was the reason he went to school without lunch so often, but I never really asked and Nicky never really said anything. Not that an 8-year-old would do either of those things. We went down to the basement after we cute the cake and took a couple photos, where there was a tiny TV and an SNES. We played video games for roughly 10 minutes before there was a loud knock on the door. Nicky stopped the game, Yoshi's Island, and jogged up the basement stairs to answer the door, eventually screaming, "Dad, I thought you said you couldn't come." He was very excited. Understandably so, considering how rarely he saw his father and what a big occasion it was in his life when he did. He would always tell me about it at school, that his cool, fun dad came to visit and took him for a ride around the block on his motorcycle. For a while, I'll admit I wasn't sure if I believed his dad actually owned a motorcycle, but when Nicky came down to introduce me to his dad, I followed them outside into the front yard and saw a big, black Harley parked in the driveway. There were 2 helmets, one for his dad and one for him. I was instantly jealous. My own father drove a minivan and wore polo shirts and cargo pants almost religiously. Nicky's dad, however, was the complete and total opposite of mine. He wasn't suburban at all. In fact, he looked like a character out of The Outsiders. Right away, I thought he was cool, and right away, I wanted to fit in with them. I should note that Nicky and I came from different ethnic backgrounds. He was white, I was not. Because I went to school with majority white kids and lived in a town with majority white population, I found it very difficult to fit in sometimes. That was part of the reason I had grown too close to Nicky so quickly. He was pretty much the only kid in school who gave me the time of day and I him. The other kids didn't like me because I looked different, and they didn't like Nicky because he wore old, faded clothes. He was raised on a modest salary. His mother had a few jobs, if I remember correctly. She was a waitress, a grocery store clerk, and a part-time janitor. For a single mother with 2 growing kids, a house, and a car that was always breaking down, she was really quite optimistic. I liked her a lot. She was always nice. Even when she caught one of the bullies in school shoving Nicky to the ground once, she was nice. So when she wasn't nice to Nicky's father, and when she pulled him aside to ask him to leave the party, I couldn't help but wonder why. My mother picked me up soon after, and I made a pact with Nicky that I would come over again very soon. Because my mother had finally met his in person and spoke with her, I was allowed to come over and play now. Before that she would always tell me, not until I meet his mother. From that point on, I went over to Nicky's house 2 or 3 times every week. Sometimes his mother would be there, sometimes his older sister would be there. One of them was always there to look after us and make sure we didn't get up to any trouble. We would usually just go down to his basement and play video games, or, when the weather would allow it, we would ride bikes in the cul-de-sac and jump on his tiny trampoline. He was always better at flips than me, and I kind of resented him for it. One time he tried to teach me how to front flip, and I nearly landed on my head. The second I got to my feet, I ran away and started crying, mostly due to embarrassment. I wanted Nicky to think I could hang, but I couldn't really do any of the cool things he could. My own parents thought trampolines were too dangerous and forbade me from jumping on Nicky's. I used to do it, anyway though. Kids will be kids. Nicky thought I was cool though, and to get my crybaby ass to feel better, he admitted he was a little jealous of me. He said he was jealous of my new clothes, my new bike, and just everything new that I had. That was the first time he opened up to me about being less privileged. The SNES in his basement was an old gift from a cousin of his who lived in the next town over, but it barely worked half the time. That was probably why his cousin gave it away. We sat in his basement for a few minutes talking about all the little reasons we were jealous of each other, and then his sister came down to say she was going to the mall with her friends, but that their dad was coming over to look after us. Their mother was at work that afternoon. For whatever reason, Nicky was shocked to hear his dad was coming over. I took it as a surprise visit and ran outside with Nicky when we heard the motorcycle. Indeed, his dad was there, and he also had a late birthday present for Nicky in his hands. It was a box, roughly the size of his head, and it was wrapped in newspaper. When we went inside to open it, he made Nicky promise not to tell his mother what he got him. Apparently his mother didn't want Nicky to get a present from his dad, but his dad bought him a present anyway. Nicky readily nodded, so I followed his lead. I watched Nicky tear the newspaper to shreds, revealing a brand new Polaroid camera. Nicky had no idea what it was at first, looking to his dad for answers before I excitedly said, "A camera. You got a camera." I could tell Nicky felt embarrassed that he didn't know right away, but he was also just so happy that he got something. He brushed the embarrassed aside, and we opened the box to play with it. His dad taught us how to use it, and explained how it worked to us. He pointed it at Nicky and snapped the first photo, flapping it in the air after, and then showing us the final product. It was very cool to me that the photos came out right away. My family had a camera too, but we had to wait for the photos to get developed at a store. By that time I'd always forget and lose interest. But Nicky's new Polaroid camera printed out photos right away. Nicky loved it, and I loved it, and his dad really seemed to love it too. When his dad pointed the camera at me next, I smiled like a dork and we all laughed at the photo after. My front teeth were missing, and I looked like I was high pretty much. Nicky and I traded our photos after. He kept the photo of me, and I kept the photo of him. We said we'd be friends for as long as we kept the photos of each other intact, so I took extra good care of mine. Now that we had a new toy to play with, I was always asking to go over to Nicky's. Because I lived in a house with so many other family members and relatives, I felt lost there sometimes. When I went to Nicky's, I felt more like I belonged, and it was always quieter there too. It was the mid-90s at this time, so parents were less strict with their young children, and mine allowed me to spend hours at Nicky's as long as his mother was okay with it. She always was. She loved having me around because she knew how happy it made Nicky to have a friend to hang out with. My mother would frequently send me to Nikki's house with some sort of dish or snack, and she even invited Nikki's family to my house for dinner once. My family really liked his family, and I think my older brother had a tiny crush on his older sister, but she was all about neighbor boy, so tough luck, bro. For this reason, I was allowed to go to Nikki's house almost every day now. He didn't live too far from my house either. We were within walking distance of each other, maybe 5 blocks away. His house was one of the few places I knew how to get to, apart from my own. There were times when I would go straight to his house with him from school, and times when he would come over to play with me at mine. The latter happened rarely, as we both preferred his house. Mine was just way too crowded. One day at school, Nicky told me his dad had come over the other night and got mad at him for not taking any new photos with the Polaroid he got for his birthday. Both Nicky and I loved the Polaroid, and we thought it was very cool the first few times we played around with it. But as most kids do, we eventually lost interest in it, and Nicky sort of just tucked it under a blanket in the basement and forgot about it. I guess his dad didn't like that very much, so Nicky asked me if I'd help him take photos for the next time his dad comes to visit. In fact, his dad specifically requested that I be in the photos. I found this perfectly normal as an 8-year-old. I figured Nicky's dad wanted us to have fun with the camera and immortalize our friendship, make a scrapbook or something. Up until this point, Nicky's mother and sister still had no idea he even had a camera. I agreed I would come over soon, and we would take a bunch of silly photos. But Nicky forgot to mention one thing to me. He forgot to mention that his dad would be there. It was the same story as last time. His mother was working, his sister was at the mall with friends, presumably with money their dad gave her, and their mother had no idea any of this was going on. I went over there after school, and I noticed the motorcycle parked out front. Nicky didn't seem surprised to see it, but something about his mood was off that day. I figured it was because he got in trouble the last time he saw his dad. Because it was raining a little, we went inside to hang out in the basement, where I thought we would play on the SNES for a bit. But that wasn't the plan at all. Nicky's dad was in the basement. He greeted me with a big smile and asked us how school was, if we did anything fun at recess, what kind of things we learned in class, the usual. I thought nothing of it, as my parents would always ask me similar questions. Eventually Nicky's dad said we should start taking photos, so I obliged. I smiled widely for the camera, but instead of pressing the button and laughing at the photo like we had done the other day, Nicky's dad tooted at me and said I should try to look prettier. I had no idea what he meant by prettier, so I just smiled a little smaller and held it for a second before he corrected me again. As you can imagine, he kept at it, nitpicking at me until I let my hair down, telling me to pinch my cheeks before every photo to make sure they were flushed, rosy, and pretty. This whole time he hadn't taken a single photo of Nicky. Because it's been decades, and because I've somehow managed to block most of this out, I'm not entirely sure what led up to it, but Nicky's dad eventually convinced me to start taking articles of clothing off. First my jacket, then my socks, and then my cardigan, and then he asked Nicky to get in the frame. This whole time Nicky had been standing off to the side, not saying a word, and not looking at me either. It was like he felt something was wrong, but he was too afraid to say it. What ended up happening is exactly what you think. First, Nicky was told to hold my hands, then hug me, then put his face really close to mine, and then he was told to kiss me on the mouth. His dad snapped photos of it every step of the way, asking Nicky questions like, "Isn't she pretty? Don't you think she's pretty, Nick? Do you want to take her on dates?" It was a whole lot of that and a whole lot of touching. The whole time I stood completely still, not really sure of what was going on. Had any other boy been there with me, I'm not sure I would have remained so calm. Because it was Nicky, I felt somewhat safe. I didn't feel like we were doing anything wrong. The kiss was gross to me, but everything else I was mostly okay with. We stopped pretty quickly after that, the kiss, not because his dad wanted to, but because I had to go home. My mother came to pick me up. Usually my brother would, so he could talk to Nicky's sister a little bit, but he had basketball practice that day, so my mother came instead. For some reason Nicky's dad didn't go up to answer the door. He asked Nicky to do it, and I took a second to grab my jacket and sweater and put them on. During this time, while Nicky's dad and I were alone in the basement, he said he would come back to take more photos one day, and that I should wear makeup next time. I didn't have any at 8 years old, but I didn't him that. I just collected my things and got out of there to go home. I saw my mother at the door and she hugged me, asking how my day was, and suddenly, everything was normal again. For me, anyway. I glanced back to wave bye to Nicky, but he had already closed the door. The next day at school, he completely ignored me. I went to the tree and waited there all morning and all recess, and for an extra 15 minutes after school, but he wasn't there. I saw him in class, so I knew he was at school. He just didn't want to hang out with me for some reason. This carried on for the rest of the week, until one day, my mother got a phone call from Nikki's mother. I was in the living room watching wrestling with my brother, and I vividly remember my mother's smile vanishing as she listened on the phone to whatever Nikki's mother was saying. I remember asking what was wrong, if Nikki was sick, but my mother didn't say anything to me. She just nodded and listened and nodded and listened, face draining of color as though she had seen a ghost. Later, she asked to speak with me in my bedroom, and asked me very clearly, "Sweetie, who was there at Nikki's house the other day? Was it his sister Angela or someone else?" As soon as I said, "someone else," her eyes became watery and she asked what happened. I was vague on details because I wasn't really sure what had happened myself. It was such a blur to me at the time. The only thing I was worried about was Nicky, and why he had been ignoring me. Because I didn't want him to be more mad at me and ignore me for longer, I kept quiet about the camera, just saying that Nicky's dad watched us play and told me I was pretty. The last part was apparently enough to set off a huge red flag in my mother's mind. She gave me another hug, told me she wasn't mad at me, and that everything would be okay really soon. So this is what happened. Apparently Nicky's mother had found the camera, asked Angela about it, and then Nicky, quickly learning that their dad had been coming over without her knowledge. The rule was he could only visit when she was home, but the past few times she wasn't. The next day, I found Nicky under the tree at school, and he very seriously told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I asked why, and he said just because. He went so far as to giving me back the Polaroid of me smiling like a dork, the one I had exchanged for the Polaroid of him, both of them signifying our friendship. Because nothing had really happened, because the world was a different place 20 years ago, and because the photos weren't explicit in nature, nothing happened to Nicky's dad. But that's not for lack of trying on our mother's parts. I remember going to the police station, telling them everything with my mother there beside me, and repeating the story again to various lawyers. But the most we were able to accomplish was preventing Nicky's dad from seeing Nicky and Angela. Apparently, by coming to the house when Nicky's mother wasn't there, he had violated the terms of their custody agreement. When it was all over, the meetings and everything else, Nicky and his family ended up moving. Apparently Nicky knew this was going to happen, and that's why he told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I want to say I managed to give him the photo back before he left, and that we shared a pudding cup one last time. But I can't, because those things never happened. He moved and I stayed, and for a really, really long time I sat alone at the tree during recess. Eventually I made new friends. Eventually I stopped waiting for him to move back, and eventually I was a happy kid again. But I have never, not once in my life, forgotten about Nicky or what happened in his basement that day. The way everything about him changed so drastically. If it weren't for his dad, I'd like to think we would have remained friends, at least through childhood. The silver lining is social media exists, and when I was 17, I found a friend request from a boy named Nicky in my notifications. It was the summer of 1996, and I was 15 years old. I grew up in a good neighborhood in a typical Swedish university town with my dad. I was a pretty well-behaved kid, did good in school, didn't smoke or drink. In fact, I didn't want to go to parties. I didn't have a boyfriend, but I had a crush on a boy at school, and I felt pretty sure he was curious about me too, but we were both shy people. This took place in the end of August, when the light summer nights start to slowly grow darker and the days shorter. It was a very hot summer, though, and all the popular girls would wear white tight tops to show off a flat tummy, and one day I had bought one for myself, just to try and see what it was to be a normal teenage girl. I had those silly shoes too, the Spice Girls-inspired ones that sprained many ankles during that era. Afterwards I wondered if the outfit is what started it all. Suddenly I started to get notes. They were placed in the basket of my bicycle. Notes with messages such as "like your style baby" and "growing into a woman before my eyes." I didn't tell anyone. I strongly suspected the idiot gang at school. 2 of them lived close to me. And I thought they were teasing me for changing my style. Teenage logic, we've all been there, right? To show them that I didn't care, I wore my new style all the damn time. One morning I noticed that someone had stepped on the flowers in the flower beds under several of our windows, and I told my dad about it. He worried it was someone checking the place out, planning a break-in, and asked me to turn on the alarm whenever I was alone. Things had gone missing before, insignificant things, but still. You never know. My dad owned a rather successful small business, and to celebrate the 10-year mark, he wanted to treat his employees to a weekend away, and had booked a place up north in Kiruna. I was used to being left alone at home. Sometimes his work demanded that he traveled for a week or so, and it wasn't a problem. Again, I was a good kid. And anyway, only a few houses down the street lived a couple that we knew, and they usually checked in on me if I was alone for many days. They had no kids of their own, and often helped out with everyone else's. It was on the Saturday that it happened. I arrived home very late, on my bicycle, after having watched Cutthroat Island at a friend's place. I walked in the front door and noticed a draft. Had I forgotten to close the window before I left? Then I noticed that the alarm was turned off. Had I forgotten that too? I walked through the house to the living room, when suddenly Mr. W., the man from down the street, stood in front of me. "Hi there, kiddo, did I scare you? I just came to check in on you." I found this strange since it was well past 01 at night, and he smelled of alcohol. "I'm fine, I'm off to bed now," I said, and got the strangest feeling. Despite it being a hot summer night, I was shaking with cold. Something inside of me told me that this was an extremely dangerous situation. Something about him was off, as if he was wearing a mask, as if someone else was behind his eyes, not the friendly Mr. W. that I had known my entire life. "Wine," he said, and nodded in the direction of a wine bottle. I shook my head no. "I don't drink." "My dad," I said, and tried to sound normal, but my voice didn't feel like my own. "Oh, you're almost a grown woman now. You can do as you wish," he continued, pouring wine into an unwashed glass. "I've been watching you. You have really grown." He kept telling me how beautiful I had become, and how he had noticed my new clothes, and that I surely knew that it was an open invitation to men. "I'm a nice person, don't you think?" he said. "I will be good to you. You can trust me. I will be real gentle." I start to back towards the front door, but he stops me by grabbing hold of my upper arm and pulling me towards him. "Don't be like that. No one likes a tease," he says, and when I try to break free, he laughs and goes, "Wanna play, I can play," and starts to shake me. I feel how much stronger he is than I and realize I have to make him let go long enough for me to run. At this point, it is as if someone else hijacked my brain, and I started saying and doing things that I wasn't even aware of until afterwards. "Yeah, I like to play," I hear myself say, and he smiles and starts to touch my hair. He dragged me off to the bedroom, and I tried to pretend to be into it. I had never had sex, or even truly wanted to have sex, and I had no idea how to fake it, but I tried. The moment he tossed me down on the bed, I said, "You must go lock the front door, and turn on the alarm," as I tried to look eager and not scared out of my mind. "Okay," he said, "don't move." I was on my feet faster than I thought possible, and locked the bedroom door from the inside. My plan had, however, not turned out as I had hoped. He had taken me to my dad's bedroom, not my bedroom. My bedroom had a window that lead out on the roof of the garage, and from there I could have jumped, but this room had no such escape. But it had a phone. My brain had forgotten the number to the police, and the only number I remembered was my dad's work phone. He answered almost right away. My dad phoned the cops from his other phone, and I still had him on the line while Mr. W. tried to open the lock with a screwdriver, shouting at me and promising to gut me like a fish when he got in. My dad also phoned another neighbor, Mr. K., who used to be in the military and often bragged about how he would treat any burglar to a trip to the emergency room if given the chance. Mr. K arrived before the police, and he didn't break his promise. But the sound of the fighting outside the room was terrible, and I had no idea who was on the winning side. Mr. K was an old guy but fit, but what if Mr. W had a weapon? I don't think I dared to breath until Mr. K asked me if I was okay. And I didn't dare get out of that room before the police arrived, and even then I was almost unable to move, as if my mind had escaped my body. A man who I had known since toddlerhood had suddenly started to stalk me, and planned to use the fact that my dad was out of town to rape me, and God knows what else. I trusted him, and I had been so wrong. I still have trust issues today. I spoke to his wife once, long after the incident. She had filed for divorce, and she told me that the reason she refused to have children with him was that deep down she feared that they would not have been safe in their home. This happened within the last 24 hours. I live in a large city in the U.S. Like many people, I have taken it on myself to try and get back in shape during the new year, so I've recently gotten into running and lifting 5 days a week. Yesterday was a run day for me. I usually start at my apartment and cross over to this long park that runs the river close to my apartment. The park is filled with sports fields, tennis courts, and many runners along the pathway. I've been going 2 to 3 times a week for just over a month. I was on my run last night listening to a podcast minding my own business and decided to go a little further than I normally do. To this longer stretch where the park sorta ends for like a half a mile before it picks back up, kind of an area where they park equipment. Many people avoid this area due to it not being waterfront/ugly. I decided to run to the end of this area before circling back home. As I'm running, I see a man 200 or so feet ahead of me walking my direction. Not unusual at all. I've passed like 40 people already. But this area is empty except him, and I, as most people, circle back. Still, I ride my bike here to commute for work and have never gotten weird vibes. I'm also an average-built man and feel pretty secure most places in my relatively safe neighborhood. I keep running, listening to my podcast when I notice the man's path is directly in line with me, as in if I continue 150 more feet I'd run into him. So I shift to the other side of the path, 10 or so feet. Keep running, not paying attention, look back up and he's in my path again. Still no alarms, maybe he shifted to get out of my way, and we did that thing where we both went. So I shift back to the side I started on. I watch him, he shifts to my side. I'm thinking this guy is fucking with me. I'm 50 feet away, and between there and 20 feet I keep shifting, more and more quickly. He follows me exactly to the point he is sidestepping instead of moving forward, waiting for me to reach him. At this point I take his presence in. He is 6 feet 3 inches at the shortest, in jeans and black hoodie with the hood up. Can't really make out his face due to a street light behind him casting a shadow. I begin to realize, oh fuck. I come to a stop and go to pull my headphones out and begin the sentence, what the fuck, man? I get to what the F dash when he raises both arms above his head and begins to scream at me. No legible words I can hear over my podcast. I do notice he has something long and white/biega in his hands. At this point, I begin to backtrack, keeping eyes on him. All of a sudden, he dashes towards me running with his arms stretched out to grab me. I turn and hightail it the other way. It should be known I am not in the best of shape. I've had numerous injuries requiring surgeries, and I've just done about 75% of my intended run for the night. But I've never ran faster. He kept pace and closed much of the distance, but when we started going slight uphill, I continued to make ground. We came to a fork in the path after about a minute of this. The two paths circled around a fenced-in area that contained construction vehicles, mowers, etc. I made it look like I was going one way, and at the last moment dashed the other way. The paths kind of made a circle, so I was able to get far enough ahead to where he couldn't see me via the fence and bushes, and when I felt like it was my chance, I dove into a bush, clawed my way under the fence, and crawled through the space and out the other side of the fence. He kept looking for me in the bushes, prowling back and forth, and finally saw me on the other side of the enclosure. At this point I was already on the phone with the police trying to get help as gulped down breaths of air. I was also warning runners. He eventually just followed my pace opposite side of the fence. He kept ducking into darker areas around the enclosure, and eventually I lost sight of him. I began getting worried again and kept wandering around, warning people while I waited on the cops. After about 15 minutes of not seeing him, I pieced the fuck out of there as the cops said they were close. The jog home was horrible, and any time a runner passed me I would have a mini panic attack. I was in shock and running off adrenaline the remainder of the night. I'm not really sure what happened or what was going on. It felt like it was from a movie. Today I checked the Citizen app and Twitter to see if anything had happened, and I'm not sure if it's related. It most likely isn't. But 5 hours after I called the cops, they pulled the body of a man out of the river a mile or two downriver from where the attempted attack occurred. My New Year resolution, 2012, was to get in shape again. After my first kid was born, I had lost my athletic interest, but I had every intention of getting it back. So I started running 4 days a week with my friend Hannah, who is a great runner and motivator. We would run after work, 5 to 10 kilometers, usually favoring the forest trail. It's the kind of trail that got lightning in the darker months of the year, so you can run there anytime really. Once you turn on the lights, you got 45 minutes to run the shorter trails and longer to run the longer ones. Then the lights shut off automatically. We had been running for about 2 months when we started seeing the same man hanging around the parking lot every time we got there. Thin man, 25 to 30 years of age, always dressed in sports clothes but never actually running. He never looked you in the eye either. We speculated that he could be homeless camping nearby, because he was constantly there. We got used to seeing him, sitting somewhere close by, silently and always on his own. We felt sorry for him. He never seemed to talk to anyone or interact at all, but there was something about him that made us hesitate to talk to him or ask if he was okay. Can't pinpoint what it was, but something wasn't completely right with him. One evening Hannah didn't make it to our run, and I decided to go on my own. I arrived at the parking lot, my car being the only car there. I did some stretching, turned on the lights, and set off on the 5 km trail. I hadn't seen the thin, silent man when I started my run. Perhaps it was getting too cold to sit there now that it was autumn, dark, and getting closer to the freezing point. He must have been there though, somewhere in the shadows, because when I got to the top of the first steep hill I could hear heavy breathing somewhere behind me. I look over my shoulder and I see him. He is running like a man obsessed. In regular shoes, not running shoes, with his arms moving in a really strange, stiff manner as if he was made of metal, his hands like arrows, straight and in an upward/inward angle. Sort of like a sprinter but more extreme, moving like a robot. For the first time he looked me straight in the eyes, and it was the eyes of a predatory animal, and it made my heart freeze. He had never done anything to harm me, or anyone else as far as I knew, but the look in his eyes alone was enough to let me know that I was facing a serious threat. I started running faster, trying to create distance between us, and I could hear his heavy breathing getting even more strained. I ran like my life depended on it, adrenaline pumping through my body and giving me new strength. I tore off my necklace and threw it on the ground thinking, I must leave a trace if he takes me. Something must be left behind. I tried screaming, hoping someone would be close enough to hear me, but I couldn't scream my lungs out and keep up the phase at the same time. Why is he doing this? What does he want? Who is he? I thought, as I started to feel my lungs burn. Then I thought of my 15-month-old daughter and ran until I could taste blood in my mouth. He was still behind me, maybe 100 meters behind now, but I figured that if I trip and fall or run out of energy or fumble with the car keys once I reach the parking lot, then I'm screwed. So once I reached the sharp turn on the trail, I went off the trail and ran straight into the dark woods. I ran only a short distance, and then I laid down flat on my stomach, my hands searching for a rock to defend myself with if he found me. I realized that I was wearing bright running clothes with reflexes and neon coloring. I had ever felt so visible in the dark before. I could hear him reach the turn and, thank God, keep on running. I started to slowly, and as silently as possible, move further into the darkness. My heart sank again, as I soon heard rapid footsteps closing in from the trail. He had realized that I must have gone off the trail, once he saw that there was no sign of me ahead. He stopped, and I stopped. I could imagine him listening for any sound, and I held my breath and begged to God I don't believe in to make him go away. After a while I heard him say something in a language I didn't recognize and walk off. I didn't move. I feared that he would wait for me by the car and realized that I had to get off the trail and onto the main road and stop someone. I couldn't go back to the parking lot. I started to make my way further into the woods, knowing that I would eventually end up on the last part of the long tail and close to the main road. The lights on the trail suddenly shut off. That made me calmer at first. The dark was a comfort and protection. But then, after only a few moments, it switched on again. This could mean that another person had just started their run, and soon I would have someone there to help me, or that he was out looking for me, or getting ready to prey on another lonely runner. I decided against waiting to find out, and continued my way towards the main road. It was dark and I fell multiple times, my clothes getting wet from the damp vegetation, and I started to get cold. After what felt like a lifetime, I could see the 10 km trail ahead, and knew I was close to the main road. Soon I could hear the traffic. Once I made it to the road, I must have looked like I had been in a terrible accident. Blood from several small cuts from the falling, my clothes dirty and my face, I assume, petrified. My bright runner's shirt soon attracted the attention of a passing car. My waving and desperate shouting made it stop. The driver, a 40-ish man with his 2 kids in the back seat, spent the next 10 minutes or so trying to make sense of what I tried to say between the sobbing and the crying. He asked if I wanted a lift back to the parking lot, and I told him no, please take me home instead. At home, my husband insisted on going to the parking lot to retrieve the car and calling the police. And report what? I asked. No crime had been committed. I just knew that he was out to get me. My husband went back for the car. The driver's seat window was smashed, and my phone was gone. So was the photo of my daughter that I had had hanging from the mirror. I don't know what he was trying to do, or why he chased me the way he did. But the look in his eyes, there was no doubt he had bad intentions. This took place several years ago, when I was 18 and freshly enrolled in college. I grew up in an extremely strict household, Asian female BTW. My parents set my curfew at 8 p.m. I wasn't allowed to drive at night or go to parties, etc. All because my family was convinced that all of these situations led to rape. Anyway, you could see how, once I moved out of the house, I relished any opportunity to exercise my new freedom and independence. One night at around 11 p.m. I got super hungry and had a real craving for an Arby's roast beef sandwich. My roommate was tired and didn't want to go with, so I hopped in my car and decided to make a quick trip by myself. To get to Arby's, I had to take a stretch of road that was really secluded and not well lit. Of course, at that time of night, there were barely any cars on the road. At a stoplight just a few blocks from the Arby's, I was the third car waiting at the red light. Car A was in the very front, Car B was behind it, and I was behind Car B. There was a last car, Car C, that was behind me. All of a sudden, I guess he must have thought the light turned, but it was still red. The car in front of me stepped on the gas and lurched forward, tapping the back of the car in front of him. The two drivers immediately got out and started looking at the damage. Neither of them were hurt, and there was little to no damage that I could see made to either car. I had no idea what to do in that situation. Again, I was a dumb 18-year-old just ejected into the adult world, and I had never witnessed an accident of any kind before. Was I supposed to stick around as a witness or something? I wasn't sure, but I felt very uneasy about the idea of getting out of my car in the middle of the night on a really isolated road to talk to these two guys, especially when I didn't think they needed my intervention at all. Again, it was a super minor fender bender, and they were talking about it civilly, though they didn't move their cars. So when the light turned green, I decided to just move over into the other lane and proceed on my way. Again, this may have been the wrong thing to do, but I didn't know any better. The car that had been behind me did not like that I was trying to leave. To this day, I have no idea what they were thinking. At the time, I thought that they must have thought I caused the accident or something. Anyway, as I shifted over to the other lane to leave, they started blasting their horn at me. I got super scared and proceeded down the road, past the green light, and the car C, the one behind me, took off after me. What ensued was still the most terrifying experience I've ever had. The car, which I could dimly see had two male figures in the front seat, followed me closely for quite a while, occasionally blasting their horn aggressively. They would speed up until they were just about to hit the back of my car. I was starting to get really freaked out, so I started making random turns to lose them, or to see if they were really following me. They definitely were. I made 3 left turns, and they were still on my tail. Eventually the car pulled over into the lane beside me and kept speeding up and nudging into my lane, as if to cut me off or run me off the road. I was actually crying now, and had called my then boyfriend, telling him what was happening. I initially wanted to drive to his house, but then I realized I didn't want these psychos knowing where he lived. I tried to avoid making eye contact with the 2 men in the car beside me, and tried not to let them intimidate me off the road. They kept blaring the horn, and then eventually the driver rolled down the window. I was too scared to talk to him, but I could hear what he screamed clearly through my window, which had a slight gap in the top that never sealed up. "We're gonna catch you, bitch. I'm gonna rape your dumb ass." I think the guy next to him said something like, "Don't slow down," or something, but I couldn't hear it as clearly over the rushing of the wind and the sounds of our cars accelerating. My boyfriend heard them shouting from over the phone and directed me to the nearest police station, which was about 8 minutes away from where I was. It was actually hard for him to find the police station or to give me directions to it because I had no idea where I was. The 2 guys kept shouting things at me, but I don't know what else was said because I was too busy blubbering to my boyfriend. Maybe it's really hard to remember what went on in those moments, physically. I was speeding so fast to try to get away from these guys at this point that I was hoping a cop would stop me. There were no cars on any of the roads we went down, and it just made everything worse and worse. And then my phone battery decided it was time to die. I seriously thought I was in one of the horror stories my parents had always told me about. Eventually I finally saw the police station my boyfriend had given me directions to, almost drove past it, and turned into the parking lot. The car followed me, and the passenger door actually opened before the car even stopped, but then I think they noticed where they were, and they drove out of there fast. I sat in my car, too terrified to get out, because I thought moving would provoke them into coming back. Literally 60 seconds later, my boyfriend pulled into the parking lot next to my car and climbed out with a baseball bat. He held me for a little while, and then a cop who was pulling into the lot, or something, coming out of the building, approached us and asked us if everything was okay. It turns out that the car that had tailed me fit the description of a car that had apparently scared a girl so badly. Same type of thing, late night, empty road, lone driver, super aggressive driving and screaming, that she crashed her car into a tree in a divider, trying to get away from these guys. Neither she or I got a license plate, though, and to this day I don't know if they ever caught those guys. I don't know what kind of human being gets their kicks out of terrorizing female drivers late at night on the road. But whoever they were, fuck those guys. I hope someone somewhere managed to put a stop to them. I've flown with my 1-year-old solo nearly a dozen times. Usually people are understanding / kind about me having a baby on my lap, and overall he's a happy, easy baby. He's also very cute, so it's not uncommon for strangers to talk to him. Usually I don't mind. The last trip I took, I sat alone in my aisle, with a man sitting by himself directly behind me. My baby was tired and fussing. I knew he was tired, but there's not a lot I could do until after we took off. Right out the gate, the man behind was talking to my baby, saying, "Oh hi baby. Why sad baby? Cute baby." I smiled and replied that he was tired, sorry for the fuss, thank you. After takeoff, I started to get him settled for a nap. The man behind us continued to talk to my baby, putting his hand through the seats to try and grab his feet. Multiple times I asked him nicely to please stop. My baby was tired. You're distracting him. He just needs a nap. Finally, I set my baby down next to me. He stood on the floor facing the seat next to me, so that I could make a bottle. The man behind me stood up and reached over my seat to pick him up. I immediately leaned forward to pick up baby, saying, "No thank you. I don't need help. Please no thank you." The man pushed me back into my seat while mumbling, "Sweet baby, why baby cry?" I replied very loudly "No," and quickly picked up my baby. I thought that was the end of that. I was wrong. I tried to rock my baby to sleep, while desperately trying not to lose my cool. As I'm rocking baby, the man behind me reached through our seats to grab my arm, saying, no rocking, you make him cry." I pulled free from him and yelled, "Do not touch me." Again, I thought that'd be the end. I started rocking baby for a second time. This time, the man behind me reached both hands around either side of my seat to hold me in place, saying, no rocking, stop rocking." I am somewhat embarrassed that I completely lost it. Clutching my baby to my chest while struggling to get free of him, it hurt. I hit the call light while screaming, "Let me go. Do not touch me, let me go." He was still holding me by my arms when the flight attendants came running. I could barely get anything out to the flight attendants. Everyone around us was staring, I was sobbing, and all I could get out was that I could not sit there anymore, and for the love of God, please move me. The man behind me tried to move with me, but I told the flight attendants that I did not know him, and he could not come with me. I had a good cry in my new seat, but my baby immediately went to sleep. I was moved to be next to the flight attendants' seats. After calming down, I explained to the flight attendants what had happened. Multiple times, the man that had been behind me got up to try to come back to my new seat, only to be turned around by one of the flight attendants. Towards the end of the flight, one of the flight attendants told me that they'd explained everything to the pilot, and the pilot had called the FBI and local police to escort the man off the flight. I would also be escorted off, as well as everyone around us that had watched everything happen. He cheered as he was escorted off. I had to interview with the FBI, and nearly missed my next flight. After my trip was done, I had to fly back going through the same airport. It was stressful and emotional to say the least, even knowing that he was banned from the airline and the airport. I haven't flown since. This past Monday, my co-workers and I returned to our hotel from a day of workout in the field. Rebecca and I walked to our rooms, and as we stood outside of our rooms, I opened mine and I saw someone in the bathroom. I said, "Hello," nobody answered. My first instinct was that it was a cleaning lady in there for some reason, and then I saw MY bag with MY clothes in her hands. I said to my co-worker, "There's a woman in my room." Then I asked the woman, "What are you doing with my stuff?" It gets a little fuzzy here because I can't remember everything I said and what she said, but she kept mumbling about how her key still worked. How it still worked, and that's how she got in. I was in shock, and she was obviously very flustered, having been caught mid-robbery. She dropped my bags and fumbled around with her purse and a white plastic bag. By this time my co-worker was behind me watching all the insanity unfold. This woman was scrambling and walking towards the door, and I said, "What's in the bag?" thinking it is probably my stuff, and so she said, No, no, it's just my things, it's just my things, I'll show you, and so she did. I looked and I didn't see anything of mine, and so since I'm obviously in shock at this time, I let her leave. I went into my room and it's been ransacked. I did a quick look around to see if anything had been taken. All of my electronics were still there. Then I went into the bathroom and I saw my underwear, my bikini, and my clothes shoved into my own bags randomly. Even my passport was shoved in there. Then I looked on the counter and I saw that she got into my medication. I'm not sure what was going through my head at the moment other than I wanted it back. So I ran out the door to go find her. I ran to the laundry room downstairs and out to the sides of the hotel, and I didn't see her. I realized I was never going to find her, so my co-worker and I went down to the lobby to tell them what happened, and then we called the police. We went back up to my room to wait, and I noticed that there is a metal bat on my bed a little larger than one of those novelty wooden bats you can get at a baseball game, but there's also a flashlight on the end. She must have left it behind in her hurry. She also left behind a necklace that must have fallen out of her bag when she was scrambling with mine. I was mostly freaking out at this point because I thought that she'd gotten away with my medication that I need. The police got there and took our statements and looked around the room as well. One thing that I noticed was that there were bits of drywall in the sink, and I pointed that out to the cops, but none of us really knew where it came from. We started looking at the door and the windows to see if she pried her way in somehow, but there was nothing. So we kind of just went with the idea that she had a spare key or something, even though the hotel front desk was adamant that there's no way that could be. The officer that came brought 2 more officers as backup because they thought the woman might still be in the vicinity. But after our statements were taken, there was nothing else they could really do, so they left. I sat down to finally make some calls to tell people, and as I'm on the phone, I'm thinking about the drywall in the sink, and it still didn't make sense to me. So I'm on the phone and looking at the drywall and the mirror on the wall right above it. And then it hit me. I got my coworker and asked her to help me pull at this mirror on the wall. And we took the mirror down, and there's a hole there just big enough for a desperate junkie to squeeze through. I asked Brian and Rebecca if I should call the cops again to let them know that I found this, and my boss said, "There's still 2 cop cars in the parking lot." So I went down to tell them, and the female cop kinda rolled her eyes, but the young guy said, "I'll come check it out." They both came back up, looked in the hole, and found a pillow, blankets, cigarettes, clothes, toothbrushes. This woman had been living in the wall behind my mirror for God knows how long. She had access to me and my room at all times. I know it might be hard to picture. There was a crawl space about 2 feet wide in between the 2 rows of rooms. One of the officers called the original officer to come back and take pictures of this. She explained to him what's going on, and all I hear over the radio is "no fucking way." He comes back, takes pictures, and is just as mind blown as the rest of us. Obviously we packed up and left immediately. What's even crazier is she has probably been there a long time. The last time we stayed at this hotel, I would randomly smell cigarette smoke, and I assumed someone was smoking in their bathroom, and it was traveling through the vents. But nope, a junkie was smoking just on the other side of my mirror. She had access to other rooms too. The holes in the walls were from a renovation, and the hotel hadn't properly patched and just covered up with mirrors. She could have been hanging out in people's rooms when they were gone. Anyway, this was insane, and I'm taking a little time off. What I saw as I exited the store made me so sick to my stomach, solidifying all of my suspicions. A white windowless van was parked in the lot directly behind my car, about a 3 parking space distance between us. One of the men seated in the driver's seat, and the other 2 leaning against the side of the van facing my car, attempting to hide out of view. I mean, how cliché and obvious can you be? Your license plate might as well read Lady Snatchers at that point. Whatever their intent, it didn't seem pure that I pointed them out to the male employee and said, "There they are," which then prompted the men to scurry into the van and speed out of the parking lot without hesitation. I truly don't know what would have happened if I walked out to my car alone, and I'm so freaking grateful I made it home safe and sound and lived to tell my story. Over the following week, I had heard there were several abduction attempts in the shopping center parallel to that target, and I'm almost certain it was the same individuals. To the 3 matching sweatsuit creeps, let's not ever meet again. In the early 2000s, my family was living in Europe, and in December of 2001 we were coming back home to Latin America for Christmas vacation. My brother and I, both in high school at the time, and my dad were flying together from Paris to Miami. My dad was seated in business class, while my brother and I were in coach, sitting in the middle 2 seats of the middle row. The flight was pretty normal at first, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. About 4 or 5 hours into the flight, I was reading a book, almost dozing off, when I heard a woman start to repeat the word "no" over and over. At first it was really quiet, almost inaudible, but it quickly got very loud and urgent. Before I realized what was happening, she was screaming "no, no, no" at the top of her lungs. I looked up and saw a flight attendant a few rows ahead of me to the right, hunched over someone sitting on the window seat. My first thought was that a passenger was having a heart attack or some catastrophic health problem, but her yelling was so unsettling that this couldn't be it. There was a strangely long delay in people's reactions. Nobody did anything. I completely panicked and froze in my seat. My brother, on the other hand, jumped up out of his seat, jumped over the person sitting on the aisle seat to his right, and ran up to see what was going on. He was up there in a matter of seconds, and as he approached, suddenly everyone around us stood up to see what was going on and or try to help. She kept screaming, and now she was struggling with this passenger. He was really tall, so tall that his whole head was visible over the back of the seat, and he had long curly black hair. My brother came back to our row and said something is wrong before going back up to get a closer look. Passengers close to her began struggling with the guy as well. A bunch of people jumped on him and started pulling at him, and someone in the row behind him even pulled his hair back so hard his face jerked towards the top of the plane. He let out a really loud moan/scream, and then there was chaos. The aisles were so crowded nobody could move, and I saw a fire extinguisher being passed hand to hand from the back of the plane. I immediately thought there was a fire and that we were all going to die. It was an incredibly hopeless sensation to know that there's nowhere to run and no way to escape this situation unfolding in front of you. They passed the extinguisher up to a male flight attendant near the guy, and the flight attendant hit him with the butt of the extinguisher really hard on the face. They started asking for belts, headphones, straps, etc., anything they could use to restrain him. My brother took off his belt and gave it to them, and they wrapped everything they could around the passenger's arms, shoulders, and torso, securing him to the seat. I saw the male flight attendant who had hit him with the extinguisher carry a pair of large black tennis shoes to the back of the plane, which at the time seemed kind of strange, but I didn't think much of it. The flight attendants asked if there was a doctor on board to sedate the guy. People kept asking if there was a flight marshal on board, but nobody came forward. I can't remember exactly how or when things calmed down, but eventually everyone was told to return to their seats. A small group of the people that helped restrain the guy were asked to keep guard on a rotation. There were always at least a few people sitting behind him and or next to him, keeping an eye on him. I think there was even someone behind him holding a fistful of his hair for the rest of the flight. The pilot announced over the PA that there had been a security breach. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was vague, and that we were being diverted to Boston Logan Airport. He said they didn't know if the person was working alone, so get to know your neighbor. We were in the middle of the Atlantic, with maybe 4 more hours to go before we could land. Things were a bit ominous and tense, but for the most part everyone was friendly and in a pretty good mood. Nobody knew what had actually happened. We weren't allowed to get up from our seats, and if you had to use the bathroom you needed to call a flight attendant to escort you to the lavatory, where you weren't allowed to lock the door. I remember a grumpy old French man a few rows from us got really annoyed after a while, and kept getting up without permission just to annoy the flight attendants. They were not happy. After a while, they put on the movie Legally Blonde to distract passengers. My brother and I went up to business class to talk to my dad. Apparently they didn't hear the extent of the chaos back in coach, and they were all going about business as usual, pun intended. A few hours later, as we approached the U.S., we saw fighter jets outside of the windows on both sides of the plane. The pilot announced that they were escorting us to Boston. A few little kids got really excited watching the jets. I later learned that these are a last resort security measure to prevent hijacked planes from repeating 9/11 style attacks. They were supposed to shoot us down in case of a major threat. We landed and were told to stay seated. A SWAT team came on board carrying assault rifles and tons of body armor, cut off all of the guy's restraints, and took him off of the plane. I saw everything in detail, since we were seated only a few seats behind him. We were parked in the middle of the tarmac for a long time before we were allowed to disembark. I remember seeing pieces of my brother's belt on the guy's seat as we left, and thought about take one as a souvenir, but thought better of it. We were escorted to a baggage claim area in Boston Logan Airport that was surrounded by a large metal fence to keep us all in one place. We were there for what felt like 3 or 4 hours, just waiting anxiously, and nobody would explain anything to us. Passengers were getting really agitated, shaking the metal fences and yelling at airport personnel that this was inhumane treatment. There was no food, nowhere to sit, and children were crying. Dozens of people were trying to sleep on the baggage carousel. They finally ordered a bunch of pizzas and led us into a waiting area with actual chairs, where each passenger was interrogated by the FBI. They were astonishingly unfriendly. I guess they were trying to discern if the guy had any partners on board. They then shuttled us to our baggage, where security officers thoroughly hand-searched every single passenger's shoes, suitcases, and carry-on bags and patted everyone down. We were finally allowed to make a phone call, and called my mom. The rest of the family was completely hysterical. They had been watching the news all day, and knew that an Islamic extremist terrorist had tried to blow up our flight with a bomb that he had smuggled on board in his shoe. We had absolutely no idea what had really happened until this moment, as we were kept completely in the dark. It was a very strange sensation. Up until this point, my dad, brother, and I had actually remained pretty relaxed considering the circumstances, and were more annoyed about the inconvenient changes to our travel itinerary than the crazy experience on the plane. We had no idea how bad the security breach really was, and how close we came to being killed. After about 12 hours in Boston, we were put on another flight home. My brother made the mistake of giving a few interviews to CNN and other networks while we were in Boston, so when we landed in our small country, he was immediately swarmed by the press, and gave a bunch of interviews despite being exhausted. I was happy to finally sit and relax with my family after the longest and most stressful trip of my life. We later learned that the bomber, Richard Reed, had actually tried to board the same flight on the previous day. He was detained and questioned by French security because of multiple red flags. He had no luggage and purchased a one-way ticket with cash, causing him to miss his flight. They put him on the next day's flight, and put him up in a hotel kind of far from the airport, since everything nearby was booked. The following day it rained, and on the walk from the hotel to the airport, his shoes got wet. This might have been why he had trouble lighting the wick in his shoe. His plan was to light it in mid-flight. He waited until the passenger next to him went to the bathroom, then tried to light his shoe with matches. The female flight attendant that first engaged him had smelled the matches, and was walking up and down the aisle looking for a passenger who, she assumed, was trying to smoke a cigarette. She saw him with the shoe in his lap, and immediately tried to take it from him. They struggled and he bit her hand. Reed is now serving 3 life terms in prison. This just happened a few days ago, and I'm extremely shaken up. Some backstory. I live on the 2nd floor of a 3-level apartment. We have a crawl space that connects all the apartments. We aren't sure why it's there, but we all have stuff in it, and none of us would ever even attempt to go inside of it, so we still felt pretty safe. The other night the sun was setting, but it wasn't pitch black out or anything yet. I'm walking through my living room when I see a short woman on my fire escape looking into my windows. This is extremely bizarre considering it's still semi-light out, and she had to literally get onto our fire escape somehow. We have 2 windows that the fire escape reaches, and she was looking in both, but didn't see me. I crawled onto the ground, and my heart was racing as I watched her try to open the windows. I didn't know what the fuck to do, because my phone was in the other room. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally left. I went into my room to get my phone to text my landlord and call the cops. I came back into the living room and was looking out the windows to see if I could locate her, when all of a sudden I hear a weird noise coming from the ceiling. We have one of those tile ceilings made out of separate slabs of cork/wood. I look up to see one of the slabs lifted up and 2 eyes staring at me. I have no clue how she got into the crawl space so quickly, but I grabbed the nearest thing next to me, which was a broom, and started hitting her with it through the ceiling, and called the cops as soon as she crawled away. They showed up and searched the place, and didn't find her until a few days later when she was on someone else's fire escape. The cops said she was definitely on some hard drugs, and that she was violent towards them. I'm glad she's gone, but whoever that crazy lady that came through my ceiling was, let's not meet again. My boyfriend, who I live with, works as a teacher in a town about 15 minutes away by train. He gets home more or less at the same time every day, give or take an hour or so. I, on the other hand, work from home. In late January of this year, we'd gotten in a pretty big fight about something stupid. I can't even remember what it was about now, but it was one of those fights where we didn't speak to each other, text, call, or anything the whole next day. So, this afternoon I was lying in bed getting work done. It was a Tuesday, and I was pretty sure his last class finished at 1 p.m. on Tuesdays, meaning he'd surely be home at 2:30. But around 1 p.m. I heard the front door open and shut. I thought, I guess he's home an hour early today. It was normal for him to skip his last class every once in a while, so I didn't really think anything of it. In fact, I was mostly mentally preparing for the awkward post-fight, "Hey, how's it going?" conversation. So I continued to lie in bed and do my work and wait for him to come in and change his clothes. The bedroom door was closed and I had earplugs sort of half in, as I usually do when I'm working, but I could hear the heavy footsteps of him walking around the apartment, as he always does. If we hadn't been mid-fight, and I wasn't so preoccupied with the awkwardness of it all, I might have noticed it was strange how slow the footsteps were, or how long he spent walking around the living room. But I was caught up in the dramatics of the fight and didn't think about it. I was just lying there, waiting for him to finally come in. Finally, the bedroom door slowly opened just a few inches. I turned my head towards the door and prepared to give him a sort of awkward, "We've been fighting for 24 hours, smile. But the door didn't open more than a few inches. I looked and saw that it was a woman's hand with red nail polish on the doorknob. Whoever was there slowly closed the door just as they had opened it, without entering the room. I jumped out of bed, ripped out my earplugs, and sort of froze there for a few seconds while thinking rapidly. My first thought, that was not my boyfriend. Then I thought, could that have been his mom? His sister? The landlady? For some reason I concluded that surely it was his mom or sister. So I opened the bedroom door and walked into the living room. There wasn't anyone there, but the room smelled heavily of women's perfume. Then I came to my senses and realized his mom and sister don't have keys and have never come over before. The landlady has never entered without permission. This was a stranger. I ran back into the bedroom and shut the door, now shaking heavily. There is a balcony connected to the bedroom, so despite the cold January rain, I stood on the balcony and called my boyfriend. He picked up, and I asked him if his mom or sister might come over unannounced. He told me no. "Don't move, I'm calling the police." The police were there in minutes and searched the whole apartment. Of course nobody was there by this point. It was weird though. Nothing was missing from the apartment despite us keeping a jar full of money right in the entrance. Nothing was even touched. In fact, it seemed like the intruder came straight to the bedroom, saw my legs on the bed, panicked and left. Plus, you can't open that big wooden front door without a key. For a few days, my boyfriend and I were convinced it was just the landlady being nosy. I began to feel better. Nevertheless, we demanded that the landlady change our locks. When she came to change them with her husband, she made a discovery. There was a square area by the keyhole that had been scratched away with something. The landlady said surely someone used tools to break into the apartment. Then, a day or two later, my boyfriend told me, "I have to tell you something, but don't freak out." He told me that the orange kitchen scissors were missing. I obviously freaked out. I tore the apartment apart looking for those scissors. It's been 6 months, and those scissors are gone. So the whole thing is just creepy and weird. A stranger breaks into a nice apartment but doesn't touch or take anything valuable, not even the money jar sitting right in the entrance. Takes scissors from the kitchen, goes straight to the bedroom, sees someone in bed and immediately leaves.